Are we good to go, Johanna? Okay, marvelous. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Ouroboros Seminar. My name is Sebastian Verosh, and I will be, as always, your host and moderator. The Ouroboros Seminar, as you know, is dedicated to the investigation and discussion of life and work of Francisco Varela, a multifaceted thinker. And the event is co-organized by Metanoia, Mind and Life Europe, and Faculty of Arts Ljubljana. As you probably know, this is the last session. So we've decided to skip some of the technicalities and formalities, and we will go immediately to the more interesting, juicy parts. And we've also got the idea that it would be nice to maybe structure the discussion somewhat differently. The paper that we will be covering is a very interesting, peculiar one. I've just realized that I've said this for many papers, but this one truly is. It's a very unique paper, as you will see if you haven't read it yet. So we would like to maybe urge you kindly to consider posing questions that would be related not only to the topics that are covered in the paper, but that would focus also on the person behind this particular paper. So that would focus on the life and work of Francisco, so that we get to know not only his ideas, but also more about his life in general, more about what kind of a person he was. I will do a very brief presentation of today's presenter, although I could probably also skip this one because everybody knows Amy. Amy Cohen Varela is a chairperson of the Mind and Life Europe Board and is involved with Mind and Life since its inception. She is also a clinical psychologist specialized in psychodynamic therapy and philosophy. Amy studied comparative literature at Brown and Columbia universities before moving to Paris in the early 80s, where she received her degree in clinical psychology at the University of Paris, wait for it, 7, with a specialty in psychodynamic theory and practice, and in parallel completed psychoanalytic training. The paper that we will be discussing today, that Amy will be presenting, is called Intimate Distances. It was published in 2001. And without further ado, Amy, I would like to kindly ask you to deliver your presentation.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Sebastian. And I wanted to particularly thank you for suggesting that I read this text for the Ouroboros series, because it's a particularly interesting text and it's brought me places that I hadn't been in a very long time. So thank you for that. I'm going to share my screen. So, when Francisco lay dying, but before he was too weak to communicate through speech, he gave me some instructions. He said, "In a short while, I will no longer be able to speak and to tell you what I need, so we have to think about that now." His organs had started to fail, but slowly. This took place over 2 weeks, his last days, which he spent at home. He was not in pain, although he had some discomfort, a racking cough, surely from accumulated fluids, and a bed sore on his leg. We had been provided with morphine in the form of a gel enclosed in patches. These were to be placed on his neck where the skin is thin, making penetration of the drug quick. He asked the palliative care nurse for the lowest dose patches. "Cut it open," he said to me, morphine patch in hand, and just swipe me with a small amount on your finger. Then we'll see. Or he'd say, cut the patch into quarters and we'll add as much as we need. What concerned him with the morphine was reaching the balance between physical comfort and consciousness. The essential thing, he said, is that I want to be there. He didn't want to be in a fog. He didn't want to miss the moment of his death. So I did my best to follow these instructions and keep the morphine levels so that he was comfortable and at the same time lucid. Francisco had set himself an intention long ago, which was to examine human experience in order to better understand the place of mind in life, or, as he famously said to Maturana when he was 20 years old, the place of the psyche in the universe. Doing brain and body science, doing philosophy were passions, but elements only of his vaster project. Experience comes first, he said. It is the red thread. He never deviated from this, even as he was dying. On the contrary, this was precisely a significant moment to investigate. So being present for this moment was crucial. When I think today about the job he entrusted to me, some 20 years later, my heart still quickens and I remember the single-pointedness of my efforts to carry out his instructions for the morphine dosages, even when it was progressively more and more difficult to know. He couldn't tell me how lucid he was as the end neared. Consciousness was thus, in a way, between ourselves to the very end. The essay, The Intruder, is where French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy recounts and reflects on the experience of his heart transplant in 1995, 3 years before Francisco's liver transplant. It starts with an epitaph. The intruder is no other than me, myself, none other than man himself, no other than the one, the same, always identical to itself, and yet that is never done with altering itself. At the same time, sharp and spent, stripped bare and over-equipped, intruding upon the world and upon itself, a disquieting upsurge of the strange, conatus of an infinite excrescent. The intruder plays a major part for Francisco to inspire him to write his own reflections on the transplant experience. It arrived in our apartment in the hands of Francisco, a small book given to him as a gift, I think, by Nathalie Duprat, some months after the transplant, which took place in June of 1998. It's a very powerful text. It so sharpened and accelerated the sense-making processes that the illness and transplant plunged both Francisco and I into, that when I thought back to my first reading of this exquisite book over 20 years ago, I felt absolutely certain that we had received it before the operation and not after, as if I'd experienced the transplant through both sets of eyes, Nancy's and Francisco's. This bears witness to the conscious and unconscious retroactive work we go through after such an experience, writing and rewriting in our minds. In The Intruder, Nancy offers a rendering of his heart transplant that is both intimate and personal. Yet each personal reflection is connected by the thread of Nancy's scrutiny of language on the one hand, and by his concern for phenomenological and ethical themes on the other, to both you as reader and you as member of the human community. I'm not sure that Francisco would have written Intimate Distances had it not been for Nancy. Jean-Luc Nancy died in last August. When I discover this, I can't help but think his transplant gave him 25 years. That the gift that is an organ is a gift of time, for as long as the organism can tolerate it, as Francisco says in Fragment 7. It's mine for keeps, if only I can keep it. Francisco in Intimate Distances cleaves quite close to the text of The Intruder at many points. At many points, he grafts his voice to Nancy's, I feel he felt an intimacy with this companion whom we never met. To speak of the genesis of intimate distance, it is helpful to go back in time to give a bit of history of Francisco's experience and his situation. We lived quite explicitly under the sign of an ending from well before the transplant in 1998. Just as our son was about to take his first steps at the end of 1992, Francisco received a diagnosis of hepatitis C, which at the time was a little known form of hepatitis. In fact, it didn't even have its own letter. It was called not A, not B. A year or so after this, during gallstone surgery, the surgeon discovered the degraded state of Francisco's liver. The doctor's statement that Francisco quotes in Fragment 4 of Intimate Distances, "I saw your liver, it looks very sick, you have to do something about it," refers to this routine gallstone operation that turned out to reveal his bad condition. Thus our entrance into what Francisco called sick world, a place where time was cadenced by the swallowing of drugs and then more medications to counteract the side effects of the former, by needles in arms, blood tests, doctor's visits, hospital stays for observation, then a liver cancer operation in 1997, which led to being placed on the transplant list. In sick world, not only time but space is denatured or renatured. Certain doctor's office and hospital waiting rooms become almost as familiar as your own living room. Many a breakfast, coffee, and croissant were had in the waiting room of medical laboratories, which in France often have storefronts with opaque windows. And there was one down the street from us where Francisco would go early in the morning to give blood or urine samples, and I'd often accompany him there. For me, this spatial extension of sick world includes the strip of Boulevard Richard Lenoir I took every evening on the short walk home from work, from my office. In this transit zone, this transitional stretch alone between work and home, I'd make deals with myself, solipsistic bargaining in apprehension of the numbers, the results of the blood work, which Francisco will have seen and will tell me about when I come in the door. Those walks became a practice, training in the examination of my anxiety, as well as in the power of my imagination to create myriad scenarios. Another of my struggles will be to quiet the scientific rationality that keeps me tightly focused on the results, on the numbers, on what they indicate is to come. I was convinced that these objective indicators would help us to see what the future had in store for us, like a crystal ball. Focusing on the numbers is a relief. Numbers can be reckoned with. The important event of receiving this week's numbers gives us something to concentrate on, narrowing our view, and briefly, fleetingly, and strangely taking us out of range of emotion. We make graphs. But this is always a very temporary relief. Slowly, I begin to recognize that these numbers are a distraction, nothing more than small boxes, repositories for my hopes and fears. Will those gamma GTs have gone down? Where are the transaminases this time around? With time and some help, I perceived that concentrating on what can be contained in this story and what can contain this story, these series of numbers, impede my capacity to be present to and what the three of us are living now, moment by moment. Thinking objectively about the numbers is protection. It is a defensive stance that must urgently be abandoned, but abandoning it feels painful, like abandoning the last vestiges of control. It's terribly hard to stabilize. Now, as I think about this, I notice that my thoughts about hope and fear echo Francisco's when he writes about the experience of the transplant in Fragment 3 of Intimate Distances. On the one hand, it is an experience of the technical virtuosity of medicine that can repair a faltering or failing mechanism. And on the other, it is a quasi-spiritual fantasy of receiving the sacred gift of life from an unknown donor. But between these lies the lived experience that must be drawn out in other parameters. as Francisco writes. Between the hard numbers and the projected hope or despair, there's a path that is laid down by settling in, by settling down, and dwelling in the lived experience. What are these parameters that guide Francisco's exploration of his experience? He gives a summary of them at the end of Intimate Distances. He says, old themes from phenomenology have reappeared throughout this analysis: the lived body and its exploration, the unalienable alterity of our lives, the key ground of temporality, bodily technologies, and ethics. Of course, these themes are all there, but what I'd like to highlight in particular is how this text is laminated. Underneath the phenomenological reflection and bonded to it in a kind of layering or sedimentation are older motifs: autonomy, autopoiesis, the body as meshwork, identity, and the selfless self. As in many of the other texts we've seen together during this series, Francisco builds by superimposing concepts to create an organic conceptual composite. This method clearly calls to mind both Inaction and the neurophenomenology program, with their intent to hold both the experiential and the biological in generative tension. This is done by accretion of sedimented layers that are connected sometimes by visible concepts, sometimes more secretly. Here, this lamination is a medium for two ends: one for expressing the force, intensity, and impact of his experience, and to find a way to word it, to develop a lexicon for a novel experience, and two, to express this lived experience in a way that holds the tension between all the perspectives, that of the objective body, the lived body, and the intersubjective horizon or context, never giving in to reduction. It is for this reason that I call it a bushy text. It's thick and unruly. Francisco covers a large amount of ground in it. He'd finished it, but hadn't, as far as I know, done much rewriting or polishing. The language is sometimes approximative and telegraphic, yet at moments the concision gives way to formulations that are all the more shining and juste for not having been worked and reworked. Reading it, I feel the tempo of urgency that was that of the anticipation of the transplant and the black hole in time that was the night of the operation, followed by the edgy watchfulness of post-implant life. I also feel the pull to draw it out, as Francisco says, to expand each moment and to use his understanding of the organism and the tools of phenomenology to slow time down and flesh out the experience as one of the flesh, la chair, that is to say, both submitted to and lived. Francisco draws it out in 11 chapters or fragments, as he calls them, and I will take us through each one of them, but briefly, so we have time to talk together afterwards. So I'm going to reshare my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, Amy.
Good. In fragment 1, Francisco paints us a moving picture, setting the scene. It is day 5 after the new liver has been placed into his body. He starts in the third person. We are both, the reader and the narrator, looking on as the patient undergoes a sonogram exam. Shifting to first person, the patient anxiously watches the doctors who study the screen in which his liver is represented. His whole body is consigned to the others. Here, the doctors inspecting the transplant. His body disappears as his eye becomes a single-pointed concentrate of expectancy. When the doctor finally speaks and the word comes that the liver is nesting properly in its new body, the eye recovers its amplitude and re-enters the body, becoming one with it again. Or, put another way, mental relief allows the body to reappear with all its pain and strange sensations. Or, as phenomenologist Drew later says, the pain makes the body disappear, with a dys at the start, meaning abnormal, negative, or apart. The healthy body is silent. The painful or suffering body disappears. It appears through pain or strangeness. In the next moment, curiosity gets the better of Francisco, as it so often did. And the eye leaves the body once again, captivated, captured by the images of hepatic physiology, as the doctor explains it to his intern. Francisco transforms the medical scene into an absorbing picture of the peregrinations of the itinerant eye as it expands, coming out of the tight grip of anxiety, as it settles back into the body, as it is captivated by fascination with the images. I wonder if Francisco had Velázquez's famous painting Las Meninas in mind as he presents us with this multiplication of perspectives, multiple focal points, his own version of the famous painting with the sonogram screen standing in for the master's work of art. Or maybe he had in mind the words of his beloved Calderón, La vida es sueño. But it is not a question here of life or art as illusion, but rather of the groundlessness of a wandering identity. So there it is. Some 2 years ago, I received the liver of another human being. The organ came tumbling down. I've received someone else's organ. Such an assertion has no echo in the past. All the work I must do is for a little window of history before it snaps out of focus and we are to start again anew. Here in Fragment 2, Francisco invites us into the narrative of the story, as he will at several points in Intimate Distances. He was a practiced journal writer, but wrote very few texts that were, and published very few texts that were personal or narrative, at least on the surface. This story is a window within a window, a snapshot of the window. An organ, he says, came tumbling down a complex social network and into his abdomen. Never forget that Francisco's first language was Spanish, and it is never far under the surface when he writes in English or French. The Spanish for tumbling down, falling down is caerse, and the root of this word cad, to fall, as in what befalls me, what happens to me. And this root branches into a family of words like touch, contact, accident, chance, fate, and contingency, the subject of this fragment. The decision to receive a transplant is not an individual one. It is snared in a net of multiple social connections that regulate the removal and redistribution of body parts. Both donor and receiver are cogs in this machine. Francisco, in this text, makes no mention of his own pushback to the pressure to accept the offer of the graft. He saw this pressure as issuing from the exaltation of medicine at its own achievements, and from medicine's drive to permanent completion, seeking to empty the world of any kind of insufficiency, any kind of lack. He disputed what was presented as an indisputable choice. A world with no lack is insanity, or as Francisco says, it is obscene, because the scene of sense-making is forcibly full of lack, always. As Francisco says somewhere else, there is a permanent lack in the living that is the very basis of sense-making and of world-making. He felt that biomedical engineering, with its mechanistic vision of the body, turns its back on death, or perhaps the defining feature of the living. Something must come to limit the frantic drive to life at any cost. Francisco countered this pressure by doing the best he could to take his time when making his decision, contemplating it, speaking about it to those he loved and admired. Then he waited for the organ made available by accident, most likely by an accident, to come tumbling down. New body technology, novel experience. Such an assertion has no echo in the past, he says. This novelty has made of him a lost cartographer without maps. His very body has taken on a novel form. A new lexicon must be forged to explore this unprecedented experience, and concepts must be stretched and shaped to account for it. There is a poignancy here. Technology is a mediating force that links us in the space and time of its particular prowess, framing us in a window of time where we are challenged to accommodate it on the level of our lived experience. But this window is short, New ways of life appear, and our work of assimilation seems to have the same fate as do out-of-date technologies, obsolescence. Within the short bibliography for intimate distances, you will find the 1990 book by phenomenologist Drew Later called An Absent Body. When I took it from the shelf, I saw that it was quite heavily marked up. So I thought I would share a page with you with Francisco's underlinings and marginalia. I also chose it because the part that is underlined refers to Francisco's concern in this fragment, fragment 3. The body as experiencer, understood as the seamless composite of lived and organic body, Leib and Körper. He also makes reference to the Merleau-Pontian notion of la chair, the flesh, which is not the body and in fact is neither of the body nor of the world, but rather the intertwining of the two in a variety of chiasmatic relations. I'll leave the deeper explanation of this concept of the flesh to the Merleau-Ponty specialists we have here, who can explain Francisco's rendering of the lived body of experience and its relations with the world, what he calls its permeation with alterity, much better than I can. The body as experiencer, embodied and active mind is central to the rest of Francisco's analysis of the transplant as the locus of the feeling of existence, the sense of existential concern that is changing and pliable. It goes deep and wide, and yet at the same time, it is not located in the body, but enfolded in the intersubjective field. We heard a version of this in Hannah's reading of Steps to a Science of Interbeing and in Natalie's reading of At the Source of Time. We will hear more about originary or primary alterity in fragment 5. Fragment 4 on rejection and the temporality of the lived body touches on the theme from autopoiesis of stability of organization and constant flux of matter. The extraordinary situation of receiving an organ is exemplary for reflecting on the related question of what is proper to the body, what belongs to it, and what is foreign to it. How to think the body proper. Francisco returns here to the immunological questions, in particular, the interrogation of the classical immunological categories of self and non-self, and the alternative view that he was working on with Hugues Bersini, Antonio Coutinho, John Stewart, and others in the 1980s and early 90s. These reflections lead him to consider intrusion not as a foreign object that is inside him. We are all holobionts with fluid and open boundaries, open to a variety of others, and housing a host of them. The intrusion is rather the tempo, the cadence, the timing of the approach of the other. When too much other comes too fast, as was the case when the liver came tumbling down, falling into him, there is no time for familiarization, no entry into conversation. What Francisco calls, and I quote, the temporality of welcoming that is our basic condition is infringed upon by the violence of the medical gesture. Living with immunosuppression to stave off rejection was what Francisco feared the most as he anticipated the event of the transplant. Immunosuppression, the silencing of the systems that ensure bodily maintenance, is the erasure of the somatic identity within the fractal meshwork. In this situation, the world itself becomes a potential intruder. Since we have been masked, we've all had a bit of a glimpse about how this feels. Immunosuppression is the mediation that allows Francisco to be in the world, but only at a distance in an atom-braided shadow world. At the same time, the ceaseless and ever-present need to manage the hepatitis and the immune system establishes a permanent foreignness to itself, echoing Nancy in the epitaph, a disquieting upsurge of the strange. In a new augmented edition of The Intruder, Nancy adds 3 postscriptum to the original text, written 10, 15, and 22 years after his heart transplant. I quote from the second one. For the moment, however, the idea of intrusion does not cease to fade. Everything is intrusive in this inextricable interweaving of nature and artifice, which forms the world of men, that is to say, the whole world, absolutely and without outside. In fact, this intrication gives me less and less the feeling of being foreign. To what natural order would I be? And more the awareness of an ever-creasing familiarity with this body that has been mended, tinkered with, fitted out. Reading this, I acquiesce in Francisco's place and wonder how he would have written it had he lived on to this anniversary. It's possible, even likely, that at some later stage of the post-transplant game, had Francisco survived, he would have agreed with Nancy. The sense of having been intruded would fade, giving way to a perception of the ubiquity of intrusion, or at least I imagine it so, that years onward, Francisco would be doing his own tracking of the exercise of appropriation of the sense of intimacy that brands this body as mine, the home of the I. In this fragment, he starts to do this. He puts phenomenological concepts to work in order to explore the radical and primary openness of the lived body to the other and the role of this alterity in the constitution of the Leib or Share. This allows him to reaffirm the basic idea of self as process, as a relational process, as we saw with Ezekiel's reading of meshwork and patterns in life, and also allows him to affirm the processual nature of how I maintain the sense of intimacy located in the body I experience as mine, my center of orientation, even as it is determined by a constitutive relationality with an outside. The inactive self is a self-becoming, always deferred, always in relation. The role of temporality is touched on here in the context of the insistence that Francisco takes on following Derrida, that self or autoaffection or self-experience is always a heteroaffection. The constitution of the lived body, Francisco says, presupposes in its heart the passage through the other as an outside and the other as horizon. A horizon is not itself an appearance, but it is always pre-given. That is, it mediates the relation between what is given and what is possible. The I, as becoming, stands in the specious present, within its history and its possibilities. Because time is thick, the living present is never immediate. This is why the intrusion, properly speaking, is not the new liver, but the technical gesture of transplant on the body as corpo, which imposes a temporality of foreignness, violating the lived body's temporality. My sense of the intimacy of my body comes in many forms. When I'm healthy, my intimacy, says Francisco, becomes translucent, transparent. In pain, the body appears in dysfunction, a reminder of the paradoxical visceral presence. It's both mine and suddenly alien because manifesting pain. Self-touch evokes or calls forth the intimacy, but not here in the Husserlian sense of the immediacy of self-touch. All touch happens across a space mediated by otherness. But the fact that touching, even in self-touch, is always mediated does not mean that it no longer summons up my sense of intimacy. It is a different sort of intimacy. It is paradoxical, mine and open to multiplicity. Finally, it is not even the body technology that impinges upon my intimacy. The technology slips into a space of otherness that was already there. The appropriation of intimacy is interminable. It is at the same time possible and impossible. As I prepare my expose, I search in our library for this reference. When I open the book, 2 slips of paper flutter out, receipts. They bear witness to Francisco's purchase 2 weeks before the call to ready himself for the transplant. They draw me back into his intimacy. What is enacted through the particular disposition of events that is an organ transplant? What takes place between 2 events that are outside of anything we can speak of or imagine? A double extinction of consciousness. This extinction is permanent for the donor who dies and temporary for Francisco, taking just the time of anesthetic blackout before reversing itself, or so we hope. Somewhere, Francisco called an action constrained imagination. In this fragment, he gives us a glimpse into the activation of his imagination as he waited and hoped. Francisco reaches out to the dead donor, so do I. I can attest to the hyperactivity of the imagination during the wait for the fateful phone call that Francisco evokes in this fragment. In order to have some sort of representation of the donor, I, like Francisco, imagine a young man, a motorcycle accident. Sometimes I wonder how this young man's parents, in the throes of shock and sorrow, would come to accept that their son's organs be taken from him. There would be pressure, the pressure of time to make this decision. It is a question of a few hours before organs become unusable. And in this case, who was the donor, the young man or his parents? Sometimes I imagine that the donor might be a woman. Thus we clothe the real with the imaginary. Don is the French word used for the sampled graft that is sent into the body of another. It also means gift or donation. Although in English we say organ donor, we have no etymologically related word for the transplant itself. It is simply an organ, not a gift. But of course, the lived experience of transplantation is different. Donors are encouraged to give their organs as donations, a kind of gift, and receivers receive them as a present, a gift of lifetime. Gift giving and receiving in traditional societies is the principal mechanism for the reproduction of social rules, rights, and obligations. The giver is thus undetachable from the gift, and the counter gift serves not to cancel a debt or an obligation, but to bind the giver-receiver pair socially, symbolically. Francisco feels the atavistic desire to give something back, but the transplantation situation precludes this. Only the surgeon, the third link in the chain, holds the key to the identities of donor and receiver and acts as the passeur or the ferryman in the transference of the gift. Once the organ is in, these images fade and the temporality of welcoming takes over. The body must enter conversation with this transferred other. But the theory of gift exchange doesn't suffice for reckoning with how to keep the gift, how to render it inalienable, mine forever. The problem of the keeping of the organ is what Francisco must address now after the fading of fantasies about the donor. Once the work of the transference has been done, the intersubjective field of the experience shifts into a temporality of refinding bodily balance and welcoming the intruder. Organ donation and reception are no longer captured in the imaginary configurations of reciprocity and caught in the symbolic triangle of donor, surgeon, receiver. How to conceptualize the gift in order to promote the body's acceptance and conservation of this paradoxical object that is a desired intruder, one that was willed or wished for. How to keep this invited trespasser that Francisco desperately wants to make a home for. In this terse and somewhat abstruse fragment, Francisco condenses 2 sets of ideas that both deserve a great deal more elaboration. The offering as distinguished from the gift and the concept of the inalienable possession. The organ is not the gift of a donor. The donor has been withdrawn by death and anonymity. It is rather an offering that comes from a non-specific, anonymous, open field. What is at stake in an offering? It is the presentation of the object, which is extended in the direction of the other, with no expectation of reciprocity or exchange. This gesture is accompanied by the words, take this. In French, we say, tiens. It is an invitation to receive, unlike the words, I give you, which are laden with a demand for recognition and perhaps reciprocity. It is rather my appeal that you touch the offering and be touched by it, that you accept something that comes not from me as ego, expecting a return. The sublimation of the gift in the offering evokes the contingency which is always in the gift. Offering comes from nowhere. It befalls me. It tumbles down into me. An offering in Francisco's reading of the anthropologist Wiener's work on inalienable possessions is what is kept and does not participate in any kind of exchange. Inalienable, says Wiener, are possessions that are imbued with the intrinsic and ineffable identities of their owners. Godelier elaborates, comparing the sacred objects that do not enter into processes of gift exchange or circulation to the gold that is held out of circulation in order to guarantee the value of circulating money. Now that he's in possession of the organ, the work Francisco has to do is that of keeping it, of making this organ inalienable, which is an interminable process when it is a question of tolerating a transplant. The medical scans, sonograms, all this imagery is anti-sensual. Images deprived of flesh, they vivisect. I have still at home entire binders full of these images, like uncanny photo albums or macabre scrapbooks. They mediate between the embodied experience of self and the network of the medical team. This mediation makes flesh and blood and all that has to do with the tactile, what is closest to us, recede. It both desubstantializes and fragments the body. In the gesture of creating an image like a sonogram, the visualization opens up a space to alterity. The theme of the intimate is permeated with strangeness reappears here. Alterity takes the form of a spectator, the doctor with his sonogram wand, the mobile image that is me and not me, as we saw in fragment 1, but also the form of the body proper, which, mediated by the image, becomes a foreign body even to the eye, even to the person who inhabits it. Yet from time to time, Francisco undergoes an old-fashioned clinical exam in which the physician palpates his abdomen, and what is in play is the embodied know-how of the good clinician's hands, guided in their research by an embodied and physiological knowledge that, yes, feels very different from the know-how of the imagery technicians. Francisco experiences this touch, he says, with a feeling of relief. Being handled by a human hand restores the sense of unity, of being a body in space and time that is continually threatened by medical scrutiny. But originary or primary alterity makes it impossible to make a hierarchical distinction between image and touch, between palpation and vision. For the new old body produced by the graft experience, both the deep-seated and deep-rooted experience of lived body as the locus of I, and the fragmentary and two-dimensional images of the machines, both of these are ambiguous hybrids of ipseity, meanness, and alterity. Or as Francisco says, we witness a push and counterpull between depth and imaginary surfaces that become a new identity in post-transplantation life. Once again, identity is a process that is the achievement of a community, the intimate and the distant. The last three fragments of this text, like its title, Intimate Distances, stand under the sign of the oxymoron, the rhetorical figure of self-contradiction and paradox. I will only briefly highlight some points in these next two fragments to save some time. In Fragment 9, Francisco narrates the night of the transplant. He lingers on the experience of anesthesia. I was not there, he says, drowned in anesthetics. Which I? Certainly there was presence. I suffered. The I is suffering, but which I? The itinerant I that has been dissolved into a speck, a living dot, Francisco says, suspended in space by the preparation for the intervention and the anesthetic, which erases the body's intimacy. This retracted, disincarnate I is en souffrance. In French, the term en souffrance means pending, awaiting action, uncertain. This is the fate of the I when the intimacy of the lived body is foreclosed. The operation is over. It was successful. Francisco is rebuilt, but it came with an irreversible side effect. It has left him alive, but hosting death. Living dead. Not, of course, a zombie. Language and mindfulness save him from this, but bearing the mark of death that makes the presence of the grafted organ a stand-in for both life and death. This stand-in will determine the scansion of the rest of his living days. What he calls the old new alterity, the internal otherness or strangeness inherent in the incorporeal meshwork of distributed selves, you might call it an internal corporeal intersubjective field, comes to settle into a new cadence, a new tempo after the transplant. Strangeness may be at least partly temporarily absorbed in this fractal organization under normal conditions, but the strangeness or alterity marking the relation between the rebuilt body and the I cannot be restored. There is an irreversible internal open juncture between them, emblemized by the scar. Grazed profoundly, this is the living reality of transplantation, Francisco writes in the penultimate fragment. My entire identity grazed profoundly by the opening to death, sutured back and left to function in the world with a new life. Death's caress alters all. Transplantation, Francisco writes, is never in the past then. It produces an inflection in life that keeps an open reminder from the trace of the scar altering my settledness. It is my horizon, an existential space where I adapt slowly, this time as the guest of that which I did not arrange. The foreign has made me the guest. The alteration has given me back a belonging I did not remember. The transplant exposes me, exports me into a new totality. Grazed means scraped or scratched, but also touched, brushed, caressed. It's a superficial surface touch or injury in contrast to the depth of profoundly. In passing over and through his body, death and its incarnation, its metaphor, the organ, have transformed him from the inside out and from the outside in. Jean-Luc Nancy, as always, says it well in the quote that Francisco uses in this fragment. I feel it distinctly. It is much stronger than a sensation. Never has the strangeness of my own identity, which I've nonetheless always found so striking, touched me with such acuity. I has clearly become the formal index of an unverifiable and impalpable system of linkages. Between myself and me, there's always been a gap of space-time, but now there is the opening of an incision and an immune system that is at odds with itself, forever at cross purposes, irreconcilable. And Nancy here again on his heart transplant. One emerges from this adventure lost. One no longer knows or recognizes oneself. But here these words no longer have any meaning. Very quickly, one is no more than a slackening, floating strangeness suspended between poorly identified states, between sufferings, incapacities, lapses. Relating to such a self has become a problem, a difficulty or opacity. I ends up being no more than a tenuous thread from pain to pain, from strangeness to strangeness. The body itself, Francisco says, has become a constant ongoing source of foreignness, altering itself as an echo, touching every sphere of my waking life. Transplantation has made the body a fertile ground of opposed coincidental intrusions. The body is ceaselessly transforming itself under the pressure of the post-transplant treatments. The eye becomes a guest in this foreign land and must constantly adjust and readjust to the changes in order to recover any sense of intimacy or home. Between the eye and the bodily intimacy, there is an unflagging reciprocal alteration. To try to account for this, Francisco says, requires a new lexicon, a twilight language, he calls it, the secret language of the initiated, and an experienced guide. This new lexicon, when it comes, may be the only trace left of the radical novelty of the situation Francisco finds himself in, along with Nancy. Once medical science and biotechnology have come to make this extraordinary situation of tinkered bodies quotidian and banal. About a year after the transplant, Francisco was invited to create an installation for an exhibition dedicated to science and art on the theme of the laboratory, on the theme of research and experimentation. This is an image of his creation. His installation that he called the Portable Laboratory. As he says in his instructions for the installation, become the laboratory by standing still or sitting on the cushion provided. Proceed to do nothing. Observe with a light touch whatever comes into experience. That's the experiment. Note the specific manifestations of mind as if they were data. Repeat as many times as you can this gesture of full presence. The laboratory is now portable, and you may carry it wherever you go. Keep track of your findings. Become the laboratory. That's the experiment. That's what Francisco does in intimate distances. In making himself into a laboratory for examining this novel and difficult experience of transplantation, he lays down a path in walking, first for himself, then, and now for all of us. Thank you.
Wow, Amy. Thank you very much for this very, very lovely talk. I think that we all appreciate all that has been said. Very nicely done. So as mentioned, I would like to maybe open up today's discussion in a somewhat different manner. As you saw, we are dealing today with a different text. It's similar to some of the texts in many ways, but also very different. It interweaves so many different topics from biology, technology, cognitive science, phenomenology. It touches upon a very personal, intimate story, and then constantly embeds it into an interpersonal framework. And also all this, of course, occurs against the background or horizon of the transpersonal existential dimension, which is basically the catalyst of everything that Francisco was doing, like this constant struggle with questions that were of most importance to him. And I think that this, I feel, is what makes his text so intriguing, this ongoing openness, this ongoing playfulness. And struggle is not the right word, but the ongoing grappling with questions, with problems that are not just theoretical, conceptual, but something that touches upon something very deep and intimate for him. So I would suggest that at this point, you just raise your question, virtual hand, if you have any either questions or comments. And I will start off with a question that I personally find extremely interesting and fascinating. And I've already talked with Amy about this question, so I know the answer to a certain degree. If one can have an answer to a question like this, like when you can really say that you know the answer. It was originally sent to me by Victoria. I hope that you won't mind, Victoria, if I just read it out. It's very short. But we've seen that death plays a very important role in this article. And one could say that questions of life, mind, and death were basically, the broadest horizon in which Francisco was operating, and were the source of this questioning, this search that one can trace in his work. So the question is, how did Francisco look upon death? How did he come to terms with his own dying and death? And what was the process of passing like for him? So Amy, if you could maybe say a few words on this, and then also, since we are privileged enough to have many people who have known Francisco and who have also been a part of his journey in many different junctures, you can also chime in and maybe share a fragment or two of your own story.
Wow, thank you. That's a big question. And I do think that there are people who are in this group here who also probably had talks with Francisco about the subject of death, and it's hard to know where to start. I think in the fragment where I mentioned that something that Francisco doesn't talk about in the article, which was his resistance to, when he was proposed the transplant, the doctors thought, well, all we have to do is set it up and organize it, because of course he's going to accept. And he very characteristically kind of stood his ground and said, I'll call you back when I come to my decision, And this part of this text where he deals with this term that he uses, permanent completion, which is it's kind of an odd term when you think about it, permanent completion. But what he means is this vision of medicine as fixing everything that's broken and filling in and making more performative. He was very skeptical about that. And so, I related in what I just told you to this question of lack and insufficiency as being somehow anchored in his idea of what it is to be a living organism, or, whether you're an amoeba or a person. And so, obviously, I was going to say obviously as a Buddhist practitioner, but then I decided I wasn't going to say that. So I thought I'd just put that in parentheses. He was a practitioner, and he very much saw his practice as a preparation for death, well before he got sick. And we had lots of discussions on that subject, because I would say to him, what does it mean to prepare yourself for death, as in the death, the death with a capital D, because your own death is unimaginable. So how can you prepare yourself for something that's unimaginable? So you can imagine, most of you, I think, or a lot of you as practitioners, that wasn't a very meaningful comment for him coming from me. So we would argue about that subject. And so, it clearly, in terms of his theory, of biological theory, following very much, I'm looking down at Andreas here, following Jonas's work, it's a constitutive part of life if you follow that tradition of thinking about the living in biology. And personally, I have to say that what I expressed in the text is a lot of what his attitude, at least in his moments of strength and not in his moments of anxiety, because he had those too, was a great deal of curiosity. And the little story I told you in the beginning is 120% true. I mean, it's kind of extraordinary the degree to which he organized things when he was about to start dying, if I can put it that way, when he was really entering into the last few days of his life, to see if he could be there. I don't remember the last part of the question.
Last part of the question was, how was basically the dying process for Francisco? So how did he, how was passing for him?
From my perspective, obviously.
Yeah, for sure.
Very peaceful and quiet. He was at home. In fact, Evan came to visit us during the time, maybe for 3 or 4 to 5 days beforehand. And he got weaker and weaker. He got lots of phone calls that I would put the phone to his ear and he would listen to the Dalai Lama and, a whole bunch of interesting people. There's a kind of an interesting anecdote in there because he was too weak to hold the phone. He could hear, he couldn't speak. And a lot of his favorite friends in the Buddhist world and lamas called him up. And so I would put the phone next to his ear. And one day when one of them called, I was sort of there next to him so I could hear what was happening. And I hear this voice with a heavy Tibetan accent saying, "Francisco, congratulations, you're dying. It's great. Think about your lamas." Think about, and it was just, and I thought, oh shit. But he was fine with it. And this was the attitude systematically. So he was quite awake until about 5 hours before he died when he went to sleep. And then during that period. So I don't know where his consciousness was, whether it was dreaming sleep, whether it was conscious sleep, or if you will, or whether it was more comatose, but he then just stopped breathing.
Anyone be willing to chime in here? Maybe Evan, how was it when you had that last visit, perhaps? And whether, what, could Francisco still talk then, or?
When I visited, which was, I think I think I left Paris maybe 3 or 4 days before he died. When I visited him, he made an effort to talk with me, and he could barely talk. It was difficult, and obviously I didn't want him to make that effort because I could see that it was, that it wasn't easy. But I want to backtrack actually, because there's 3 events that are sort of salient in my personal memory with Francisco having to do with death. So obviously the visit just before he died is one of them, but there's 2 others. One was at a Lindisfarne Fellows Conference in 1993 in Crestone, Colorado. And at that, so this was a meeting that my dad organized, and there were a bunch of people there, scientists and artists and spiritual teachers, kind of the usual Lindisfarne mix. I remember Stuart Kaufman was there, and David Finkelstein, the physicist, was there. And David gave a talk. I don't remember the details of the talk, but it was something about, his work in quantum physics. And somehow at some point in the talk, maybe it was in the discussion, the topic of death came up. And David, who died a few years ago, I think 2015 or 16, David died, and who was a bit older than Francisco, if I remember correctly, sort of slight generation ahead. David said something along the lines of, death wasn't an issue for him, or he didn't fear death. He wasn't afraid of death. And afterwards, I was just speaking to Francisco one-on-one. And I think Francisco had, at that point, Amy would know the chronology, but my memory is that Francisco at that point had gotten a diagnosis that was dire, and he didn't know the time. So this is 1993. He didn't know the time course, but it was a dire diagnosis. Maybe it was the time when they saw the liver, when they
Yeah, it was in February, March of 1993, or January, February 1993 that he got that. So yeah.
Okay, so then that's what it was, because this meeting was in August 1993.
Mm-hmm.
And Francisco, he was angry, actually. He said to me, that's just a foolish thing to say about death. Mm-hmm. And I was a little bit surprised. And I said, but well, maybe that's how David feels or looks at it. That's just a statement of his own attitude, his own experience. And Francisco basically said, he's just not facing things. He had, this is just a kind of false consciousness. That wasn't the word Francisco used, but that's my word. But that's in effect what he was saying. And he was really quite angry, actually, not like personally angry at David, but angry at the thought. And it really stuck in my mind and made me think about just, the different ways that we, forecast our relationship to something that is in some sense unexperienceable, although, as Amy says, Francisco might challenge that thought. And I should also say that that was a very, intense meeting, because there was another person there, the daughter of Saul Mendelwitz, who was a Lindisfarne Fellow, Jamie Mendelwitz, who had been diagnosed with, I believe it was breast cancer, and who died a few years later. And she knew she had cancer. She didn't know whether she was going to make it. She and Francisco immediately, bonded over. She was a little bit older than I am. Jamie was my generation, slightly a few years older than I am. And so they immediately kind of bonded over this experience of, having an illness that is, that has that kind of dire prognosis. So that was one situation that quite struck in my mind. The other one was actually really the kind of last time that I saw Francisco before visiting him in Paris, when he was, already in bed. And that was at my dad's apartment in New York City, in Manhattan. And it was at the end of 1999. Mm-hmm. And Francisco and I, actually it was at the end of, no, it was at the end of 2000, year 2000. And in the fall, and Francisco and I were working together on the paper Radical Embodiment that was published well, it was actually published after Francisco had died. And so we would, work during the day on the paper, and then, we'd have meals and conversations and, wander around the neighborhood in New York City. It was really lovely, wonderful time. But we had one conversation that was about consciousness and death. And Francisco would often, especially, when I was kind of older and more collaborating with him, he would often kind of express ideas to see what my reaction would be as a kind of philosopher friend. That was sort of one mode of interaction we had. We had the mentor, we had the older brother, younger brother, the uncle, the nephew, and then the sort of like, let's test this out idea kind of conversation. And he basically said to me, well, I've had experiences And I know of other people, of course, who've had experiences where there is the sense of a kind of, invariant awareness distinct from any changing content or any state of flux, a kind of ground state awareness. And because it's invariant, it makes sense to suppose that it would be invariant across the change of life and death. And I said, well, but that's an impression from within, and awareness doesn't, unless you think awareness reveals its own nature transparently, you can't make an inference like that, no matter how subjectively compelling the impression may be. And so we kind of batted that back and forth, not in an argumentative way, but just in a let's see if we can look at this from all angles. And of course, it's an unresolvable kind of issue, and we didn't resolve it to our satisfaction. But it was a very intense conversation, and it's one that came up for me repeatedly, especially when I was writing Waking, Dreaming, Being. Mm-hmm. And then the third time, of course, was when I visited Francisco, and I was able to see him, and it was a very beautiful and profound moment, because I was, he was still very, very much conscious, and I was able to express my love for him, and he was able to to really be present in that moment. And then when I left and got back to Toronto, then a few days later he died. So that was an extremely precious moment that obviously stays in my memory more strongly than the other ones, of course. But those are the three very salient events around the issue of death that I remember with Francisco.
Thanks, Evan. Thank you very much for sharing this. Good 3 stories, I have to say. I would have a question, like a more general question. When I reread this paper, and it's something that we brought up already in our other discussions, but one has the impression that in these later years, as if there's the feeling that Francisco somehow, I don't know whether this is the right way of putting it, but the idea of otherness, alterity, start becoming more prominent and present in many different guises, forms. So the question, of intersubjectivity, of the other in general, but also like transcendence more generally, I would say. There's a lovely paper that we didn't have the chance to cover that refers or tackles with the question of transcendence. And in this paper, one can sense this alterity, the otherness. And as I mentioned last time, when Natalie had her presentation, you often get this interesting image with Francisco where you have a text and Francisco would mention certain themes, certain ideas, certain notions that you know from before, but they are put in a different structure, in a different pattern, and they form a different gestalt. So you recognize them, but you don't really recognize them because they acquire a different meaning in this particular new setting. And I had the same impression here when reading this text. Of course, he always draws on his early work and work on that's related to autonomy, work that's related to the meshwork of selves, and so on and so forth. But he puts it again in a different framework where all of a sudden it acquires a seemingly different orientation, a different meaning. And this topic of alterity, this topic of otherness, in again many different guises, seems to be very much present here. And I was just wondering, is this engagement with his own mortality, this phasing of death, this shadow of death that he was carrying with him. Could this be a part of the story as to why he was becoming more and more interested in this and more aware? Because, you know, if we look at the early Francisco, who in a certain sense started off with this idea of autonomy, autopoiesis, a very almost radical constructivist point of view, where you have an organism that somehow constitutes its world in a ontologically very strong and strict sense of the term. When you read this paper, you know, there is no coincidence between even the lived light does not coincide with itself. Even when the hand touches, you know, the other hand, there is always the alternative, there is always the gap, which doesn't mean complete otherness, but there is this slack where, or this moment where you cannot coincide with yourself. The eye never catches itself seeing, you know, it can see itself, but it does not see itself seeing. And the same holds true here. So I don't know, I would just be very curious to hear your thoughts on this question or this topic. I guess, Amy, you'll have to, you know,
I was
everybody's
struggling
expecting.
when I was, you know, struggling a little bit, working on some of the themes in this text. I kind of thought a little bit in the same direction. And I thought that there were a few moments in the text where I really would have, you know, loved to have had either John Protevi or Natalie Duprat by my side to hold my hand in the Gnossian sense of the term while I was looking at some of these things. What came to mind, so it would be great if you could say something about, one of you, somebody could say, one of our phenomenologists could say something about this notion of a funny idea that's probably anecdotal came into my head when you were speaking, Sebastian, and it might be anecdotal, but I thought to myself, where would Francisco have gone had he not died in his thinking? You know, I was just, and then I thought about where he had been with autopoiesis and autonomy and the work that he was doing in different types of autonomous systems and the bodily systems and all of that. And I remembered the critiques that he and also Maturana would always get to their constructivist position, which was a critique of solipsism. You know, these are, which were, you know, and Francisco spent an awful lot of time and energy countering those critiques, you know. So I think that, you know, maybe this movement is the movement that he would have taken further, but it's also a kind of a natural movement, if I can use that word, in terms of his expression of his thought, to put weight on the intersubjectivity, the alterity, and that side of things, given where he came from, and given he was always concerned with how people understood what he was saying, you know. So anyway, this idea of thinking back on those criticisms that he got made me think. What you were saying about the question of alterity made me think of that. I'm not at all certain that it has to do with, it's quite interesting, the idea of late work. So the work that he was doing, you know, when he was dying, I'm not at all sure that this question of, I mean, Natalie, you worked with him and Altair and all of those early papers, so maybe you have something to say. I don't know that it has something to do specifically with his condition, although, you know, explicitly, certainly unconsciously it might.
So you want me to say something? So
I love it.
Wow. I remember also Francisco having discussions about this issue of alterity with French philosophers like François David Sebat, there was a whole discussion. François being quite, questioning Francisco's meaning of autonomy as not including alterity. So there was this strong discussion, and also with Jean-Christophe Godard, who is also another French philosopher. He's a very good friend of mine, and there was at one point this very similar discussion. So, but I think they were missing the point actually, because very early Francisco thought about even this acoplamiento, this coupling movement. I mean, very complex movement is actually including alterity within the self already, I would say. So I think they actually missed the point. I mean, it was easier for them to see autonomy as something not including alterity, but I think it's a bit simple. And maybe the other thing I could share is not about death, but because it would be too difficult. But more about we had discussions actually, and maybe Amy, you had as well discussions with Francisco about this during the whole process of waiting for the graft, and then the experience of the graft itself. We had discussions with comparisons actually with what's going on when you are pregnant, and when you are when you're having a graft organ in yourself. So these two different experiences of alterity from within, which are of course quite different, but they share similar. I mean, they might share similar experiences, because when you are pregnant and when you don't keep the fetus or the embryo. I mean, at what point or the other you can't keep it, and you have a fausse couche,
miscarriage.
Miscarriage. So there is this kind of expulsion sensation, and also all the damage and the suffering and the difficulties. I mean, of this. So we had very many discussions about that, and it was at that very moment where I think Francisco was having this kind of experience and questioning about having a kind of otherness, or I mean, here an organ, but not alive, of course, progressing, but still, I mean, during the pregnancy, you have also this whole conversation or negotiation where you figure out. I mean, okay, you're in me, but I don't want to be too much disturbed by you, so leave me alone. I mean, you just appropriate what's going on, and you welcome it. Welcome it. So I think that was quite interesting and funny and nice similarities and discussions between these two kinds of self-alterity within the self. And so I wanted to share that, because I think it's interesting to.
Yeah, and it's also it probably sheds a new light on the beginning of the paper, where he draws this parallel, right? Where he talks about this specifically in these terms. And now that you mention it, that you actually had these discussions about this, makes sense.
I think I was at that point already writing something, or I wrote it afterwards. I don't know, something that's an article that's called Phenomenology of Pregnancy. So which is now published, I mean, in French and in English, I think, as well. So, it echoes for me. I mean, it echoed for me many issues and many questions as well, of course. And it was great, I mean, to have this kind of parallel in mind as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and what I find interesting here is this also like this constant play or interplay between these two different notions of alterity, namely alterity within yourself, having something within yourself, and then, you know, when does this become part of yourself and when it's still a foreign body, and then the alterity of the other, which is outside of you, but still somehow is kind of crucial in your self-constitution and unification. And there is like, interestingly enough, Amy, you crop up in precisely these two segments, both of them. So he mentions at one point, if I'm not mistaken, you being pregnant. So precisely this alterity where something is within. But there's this other fragment as well where he mentions you, and there's this other alterity, which when I was reading this was reminded of Merleau-Ponty, where Merleau-Ponty says that the living body unifies itself precisely in the other. So the body is never oriented in itself, but it's always projected outside. And only when I, for instance, am able to focus on something or grab something, it is precisely then that my body acts as a unit. It is a dynamic unity. And I will just read this passage. It is when he talks about the corticoid desert, and also then when his immune system was repressed. And he says on page 264, as I felt the effect coming in a few minutes, my whole body was swept by uncontrollable shaking, like an alien possession that left me, who, in a limbo of non-existence, looking steadily into my wife's face, the only reference point in a disappearing quagmire. So, you know, it is basically through the other, in this case, yourself, Amy, he was able not to dissolve in this chaos that he was embedded in, which was very interesting and very telling. And there are a lot of very interesting twists and turns in this particular paper.
So there's sort of a question of specularity of the other in the specular sense as well in that image.
Yeah, John has his hand raised. Yeah, John, go on.
Yeah, I was going to say that all throughout the beautiful and emotionally powerful discussion, I was thinking as well about the way we talk about the gift of life. And when we talk about asymmetry there, you could, and I wrote a paper many years ago on Derrida, Given Time and the Gift of Life. We could, any of us, in principle, we could save our parents' lives. We could extend our parents' lives. We could give an organ transplant to our parents to live them, but we can't give them life. It's completely one-directional, right? And it can never be repaid in kind. It could be stretched out. You can thank them. You can give them as a great life as you can, but you can't do it. So there's a real asymmetry there on the other side from death with birth that I think structures a lot of our lives as well. So I kept thinking along that lines when we use that term gift. And earlier you had mentioned the way in which some anthropological ethnographic classics like Mose talks about gifts. But they always have this, not necessarily an asymmetry, but a delay, right? Because you can't give the gift right back. And it's not a gift, it cancels it. And a lot of times in some cultures, you don't actually give back to the person who gives you the gift, you give it a third time. So there's a lot of alterities and delays involved with the, I guess you would say, the syntax of our verb gift and giving. That really came to me in listening to your talk. So those are just two that I mentioned, the kind of asymmetry of birth, and then the way in which some gifts require being passed on, not repaid, but passed on.
Yeah, wonderful, John. Thanks for these observations. Amy, would you like to say something, or do we move on to Andreas?
Let's move on.
Andreas.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it fits right in. Thanks, John, for what you said. And talking about asymmetries, I think we need these asymmetries to have something like a transformation, something which can't remain itself and needs to transform. And it needs to be asymmetric to do it. Otherwise, you could just shift back and forth, and there would be symmetry. So it's asymmetric. And I mean, thanks for talking about stressing this notion of the gift in this paper, which, as I was reading it today, somehow jumped to my eye because I have worked on the idea of the gift in the meantime, between now and my last reading of the paper, which was 10 years ago, happened 10 years ago. I didn't see it then, but I'd like to throw another name into the ring, which is Lewis Hyde. And he has a brilliant book on gift, which is called The Gift, plain and simple. And it's actually about the poetic process. It's actually a book about artistic creation, but it's also a book about creation of life. And actually, for Hyde, trying to somehow summarize it in a way that it keeps its similarity to what Francisco has written here. For Hyde, receiving a gift is just the starting point, which then kicks off something which he calls the circle, a circle of the gift, and this is fueled by what he calls the labor of gratitude. It's a very interesting, intricate concept. So you receive a gift, and you feel that a sort of lack in yourself, which needs to be filled with creation through your own labor, creating something which can be given away. So that is the idea, which is very acute, as I know, as a writer, about the poetic inspiration. It's about wanting to give something which has the same impact as something which you have received. But it's also very acute about life itself, about the life process. And it has to do, and that's very interesting, and that brings us to this very real topic of losing yourself. It has to do with giving away, with giving up, with not keeping the essence, with not remaining the owner of something, which completely othering yourself. And so I think there are very interesting similarities, and so I have come to see life as a gift process, actually, and which then means that there is never ever anything like fixed inside or outside, any fixed substance. So it's always a circle. If it's being able to go on, you can fix it, but then it stops. Then it ceases to be life. It becomes something sclerotic. And in this whole thing is this transformation, which then in its final or in its biggest form for human individuality is death. So to me, it makes no wonder that in a way, Francisco writing about this in the horizon of his own dying is also writing about life, because it is not different. It is only different in the sense of how big is the transformation we are undergoing, but it's absolutely the same process. Maybe that for the moment.
Yes, thank you, Andreas. Which, interestingly enough, brings us back to the very beginning, to the notion of poiesis, right? Autopoiesis, the act of producing, the act of creation, and of course to these relatively well-known ideas about living as ecstasis and living as eccentricity, which, interestingly enough, is another topic that gets nicely covered in this particular paper, where Francisco talks about taking on these various perspectives and shifting his view. So, being centered in your lived body, but also the capacity to position yourself outside of your living body and take on an eccentric position, which would be very nice to somehow thematize in dialogue with Helmut Plessner, whom we have already mentioned on several occasions. Andreas, you wanted to add something, I see.
No, I also sensed this. I was thinking, oh, wow, this is Plessner, somehow referring to Plessner, but I think I would need to reread Plessner, but I think as Plessner had this step model, and so the human was different than the animal, etc., because the human was eccentric. I think Francisco is more radical. He says, well, we are centric and eccentric at the same time, and I think that is so important. So we are absolutely identical.
Andreas, sorry to interrupt here, but this is precisely also Plessner's point. He says
very
that
good.
You are centered, but you're also eccentric. You never
good you say this.
So there is a certain primacy of your lived body, in the sense of you always will have this axis, which is somehow your rudimentary axis, but the capacity to always go outside it, so that you're able to position yourself eccentrically, changes this positioning itself, because there is, when, even though I am embedded in my lived body, this embeddedness is pervaded or surrounded by the horizon of possibility, which is not there if you do not have the capacity to eccentrically position yourself. So even your lived body is always permeated by this horizon, which is why, on a phenomenological level, this could maybe be related to this idea of having a figure and ground, because you have something that is explicit and implicit. In a certain sense, for an animal from the
Sebastian, sorry, excuse me. I need to go 1 minute and open the door, as I'm confined here, and it's my son with the dog, so he's already rung the bell twice. I'll be back in a minute.
Okay. Anyway, so as not to yes, okay. Let's go to the YouTube questions. Amy, I'll start with a question that is more related to you. Amy, would you share with us your post-death experience of Francisco? So this is also something that I was interested in. So, after the whole experience, that, and now looking back at the reflections on everything, maybe if you could share a few eccentric reflections and thoughts.
Post-death.
Post-death, so after his passing. So once, he passed away, and then now that you look back on all of this.
On that whole process, because a work of mourning is,
I think that
a long, complex thing that is, it's probably not appropriate, but
the question is phrased in only one sentence, but if I would to venture a guess, I would say that, after this talk, one cannot but wonder, how it must be when you're faced with this loss. And then, for instance, you have talks like this or whatever, and we already touched upon this somewhat. So, how is it for you now, looking back on Francisco? Is his, does this distance create a distance also in your way of experiencing him and thinking of him? As it is, for instance, when you kind of, you break up with someone and a lot of time passes, and then you figure out that this person has changed dramatically, both in how you look at it internally, her or him internally, and also when you meet that person, you see, whoa, there's a mismatch again. So just this, the whole experience of loss and looking back at Francisco now, maybe this.
Yeah. It is a tough question to answer kind of concisely, but perhaps since I've just been so plunged into that text, I could say that there was a phenomena when I went back to it. We can be reminded that you suggested this text, that I do this one for the Ouroboros, and I could see why. And I was happy to do it. I was quite surprised when I started going back into it, how emotional it was for me. So it's not as if I have, a huge amount of some kind of artificial distance, but I was taken a bit by surprise. I was touched by it in new ways that I hadn't been touched by it during all the other different readings that I'd had of it over the years. And so, and in some ways, when you think about this text where Francisco either he doesn't have a point or he has many points, he's demonstrating something. He's demonstrating a kind of a work or a process. And I think that one feels that in the text. It's unlike some other texts where there's a kind of a single idea or a single small constellation ideas he wants to transmit. There's something a bit different in this text. And in that sense, I think that it's a text that's working itself through as he's writing it. And I suspect that's why he also has all of these references, which were quite odd references for him. He bought the Godelier when somebody probably mentioned, Mouse and the Gift, and he bought the Godelier, as you saw, a couple of weeks before the transplant. Natalie came along with Jean-Luc Nancy, who he hadn't read before. He had read very, very little Derrida, in fact, before, and so for this text, he read Le Toucher Jean-Luc Nancy. So he was looking for tools, and looking for concepts and theories to be able to move ahead with somehow working this through, including, interestingly, since somebody brought up, John brought up, Pertevi brought up the question of the gift, looking into areas that were pretty foreign to the areas that he was used to functioning in. And at one point in the text, he says, basically, Mouse, and this one way of looking at the gift doesn't help you once you have to keep it. So I'm now going to look at another anthropologist who is Annette Wiener, who wrote an interesting book called Keeping While Giving, Inalienable Possessions, to help me work on how to keep it. So he was someone who used ideas to live. And so this text it's a working through in action. C'est un travail. It's a self-working through in action. And that, I think, is how my integration of Francisco's work over the years, which has been very, very progressive, because, when you're living with someone and they're alive, sometimes you ask them things about what they're doing. Sometimes you read the text they give you to read. Sometimes you don't because you're busy doing other things, Of course, when he died, I thought of, daily, I thought of things, and I still think of things that I would love to ask him and that I never did, and, or new things. So there's always that. But the working through for me has been somehow or other taking him in as I can, as I filter him through what I am, and using for my work or integrating somehow, because using isn't even the word, integrating into my work the moves, I would say, the moves that he makes that inspire me to make a similar move, even if it's in a different domain. So there is a kind of an incorporation, but at the same time, an incorporation that has to set this material to work. You know, it has to keep working and keep moving. So probably to answer the question in a really short way, I would say that I'm still working through it, you know, and even in this working through it in the sense of, you know, in the true sense of mourning. I mean, that John could tell us, you know, Derrida speaks so beautifully about mourning, and lots of other authors do too, in the sense of surviving, you know, but in the highest sense of surviving. And so he's still incredibly good company, as we all, I think, can feel. And in the session series, like the Ouroboros series, we feel his company. I feel his company, and I suspect if they weren't using that word, would use maybe a different word, but it is a kind of an accompaniment. So.
Thank you, Amy. Before I give the word to Natalie, I would just ask Louis if he would be interested in maybe saying the things that he wrote in the chat out loud, because there are some interesting conceptual differences there taken from Henry Bortoft, who is a very interesting author, and I'm really glad that you brought him up. He doesn't get mentioned too often. So yeah, maybe Louis, if you can say a few words on this.
Sure. I wanted to contribute a pair of words. The words are from Henri Bortoft. The words are compresence and coalescence. Entities are compresent if they are apparently independent of us and present in the space, such as the pencils and cups on my desk, or the computer on my desk, or the tree outside my window. And on the other hand, entities are coalesced if the self, myself, and that entity are inextricably together. So this can happen this can transfer from one to another. For example, my glasses on the desk are compresent with me, but my glasses on my nose are coalesced with me, and my perception goes through them. And so we take in others, we take in externals, and they become part of us, they leave us, they go back and forth. And this language of compresence and coalescence speaks to many of the issues we're talking about here, and also to scientific issues and other issues of thought about our relationships with one another in the world.
Thank you, Louis. This was a very useful conceptual distinction and a very nice addition or contribution to some of the things that we were talking about. I don't know if maybe Urban or not Natalie will say something about this, but if not, maybe we can touch upon that if we have not enough time later on. But yeah, very useful, and I'm really glad that you mentioned Henry Bortoft.
Thank you.
Yeah, Natalie.
Maybe Urban, if you want to talk before me, because you had not a chance to talk. I had already.
Nice gesture, Urban.
Thank you, Natalie. I would, not because I think I have something so very smart to tell, but because in 10 minutes I have to go to another room to have a meditation, because we are actually, my cognitive science group is actually, we believe, following Varela's idea that cognitive sciences should also see their own experience as a research lab, and we are trying to do that. So thanks for giving me a word. I would just like to thank Amy, because I think what I experienced today in this Ouroboros seminar was really beyond everything else, despite the fact that everything else was really great. And I am quite grateful to you also, Sebastian, for putting this together. And I think this was really, really nice series. And now it took me 1 hour to try to figure out what was different today. I mean, of course, topic was different, and as some people said, it was emotional. But I think what was different, that I finally figured out why I find Varela, despite never meeting him, so close to what I would like to do. And this is because I think he had a skin in the game. And many times I miss this when we philosophize or we speak about lab experiments and so on. And we just forget that we are actually talking about cells. And now a last thing that Amy said just now, when she said he was reading this and that, and these were tools. And this actually sort of brought me this insight that I think that he took philosophy and cognitive science and phenomenology as tools, not only to understand cognition from the third person, but to navigate through his own consciousness. And I would just like first to thank for this today's presentation, because it had skin in the game, unlike most of what we normally do. So I'm not sure if I'm missing the point or not. But I would also like to ask one little question, although this next question reminds me a little bit on the situation. I was lucky enough to meet Heinz von Förster just a couple of months before he died. And he was blissful, completely blissful. At that time, he was together with his wife, May. And there was somebody in the room who asked him about Wittgenstein, because apparently he knew him and so on. And he said, look, my friend, Heinz said, I am just staring beyond the death now, you know. So I'm really sorry, but this question about Wittgenstein looks a little bit off for me right now. So I am feeling that I'm going with my next question in that direction a little bit. And the question is, we never mentioned Maturana. And my first contact, of course, with Varela was when we translated The Tree of Life, and I was writing the foreword and so on. So I would just like to mention that Maturana passed away during our seminar, during our cycle. And when you talked, Amy, about these immunosuppressors, I thought so much close to autopoiesis, you know, because actually what they did, what they do when you take these immunosuppressors is actually autopoietic function of our body, live body is sort of distracted. So I would just like to ask, what was his relationship to his early work and to relationship with Maturana later on? Thank you.
Oh, that's a good question, Urban. I know the opposite position. So I read the two papers by Maturana on Francisco, but
Yes.
I don't know.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly. The same here. Same here.
Yeah.
Which papers were you talking about?
He wrote. Maturana wrote two papers. Well, one was a paper that's explicitly related to his reminiscences on Francisco, and it was published in Constructivist Foundations. The other one, I forgot which one, but there's another text where he also notes his memories on Francisco and how they diverged at a certain point. So that they worked together, and then they realized that their works were going in different directions, and that was basically it. So yeah, that would be an interesting maybe point, Amy, if you can.
Well, don't want to go into details of my understanding of their divergence in the biological philosophical sense. I mean, you probably can actually do that better than I can. But they did have a very big divergence of character. And so in my lifetime with Francisco, so there is, we could soften it by talking about the content and say that Francisco started thinking this way and Maturana starting this way, and so they disagreed. But they didn't have to really diverge, but they did, in my opinion, mainly because Maturana was very jealous and competitive with Francisco. And that's quite the way it felt anyway. And the difficulties really kind of crystallized around the second edition of De Machinis y Seres Vivos, when they were invited to write a new preface, and Maturana said, don't want to write it with Francisco. And that's why there are two separate prefaces to that particular book. And I was present at that time. You know, I came into Francisco's life in 87, so he was already living or 86, he was already living in France at the time. And it was post Maturana, but I do remember the moment of the De Machinis y Seres Vivos, Autopoiesis and Cognition, because I was there. And so that was, so there were, it was quite and that I can say was something that made Francisco terribly sad. So I think that as far as I know, he had, outside of the work, the conceptual part of it, he tried to have cordial relationships with Maturana until the end of his days, but it was quite difficult to have these. So that's a more personal answer.
Thank you.
Human, all too human, as Nietzsche would say, very often goes to the roots of the matter, to the root of the matters. But it's interesting that one can already notice these tensions. So when I first read the book, the Tree of Knowledge, I of course didn't notice this at all. It was just like, wow, this is an interesting book, so many fascinating ideas. But then when you read more, when I read more works by Francisco, I realized that already this book was an enormous compromise, because you can sense there are certain tensions within that book that go in different directions, and I'm now, I have a course now where we're actually going from Tree of Knowledge to Embodied Mind. So both books are covered in the course. And it's just interesting to reread the book thoroughly again, because, knowing that what I know now, I can already see these compromises. But yeah, this was it's an interesting question for me as well. So Urban, I'm glad you brought it up. Maybe does anybody else
could I just say something, Sebastian?
Yeah, for sure.
We're moving towards 8, and Gabor has to, maybe we could give him a minute, because he has to run off at 8.
Yeah, Gabor. Would you like to have a minute, Gabor?
Thank you, Seb. Thank you, Amy. I think I have nothing to say, nothing special, other than thanking you, Seb, for the whole series, for your fantastic work over the year, and for everything you have done, moderated the questions and the gentle bridges between these texts and the speakers and all the presenters during the year. And this last talk today was really touching to me personally. The whole article or paper, Francisco and Amy's sharing, Amy's reflections, and the intimate distances that we could feel in Amy's talk, in the sense how Francisco understood this term. It was so touching. Thank you so much, Seb. And thank you everyone who was here over the whole series of this program over the year.
Thank you, Gabor. And I would just like to underscore that this was basically a collaborative effort. So even though, I took on the role of a moderator, so the one who does a lot of speaking, this was organized, and it was a concerted action, a collaborative concerted action. So Gabor, thank you very much for this collaboration. It was wonderful. I'm really glad that we did this. Yeah. So maybe before we say goodbye, we can still, even though Gabor unfortunately has to go, we can ask Natalie to ask either. You still have your hand raised. I hope this is still.
Well, actually, I had only two. There were two things I had in mind while hearing different persons during after the talk. I thought maybe as future researchers, it could be interesting to investigate why Francisco actually never really, maybe I'm wrong, but never really mentioned or worked with Levinas books or Levinas philosophy, since alterity and in the radical sense of the word is really at the core of Levinas philosophy. I don't remember having had discussions with him about Levinas, although he's a very important philosopher for me. So I'm just wondering. It's also a question I have actually 20 years after. Why this absence? Well, so it's a question, actually, more a question than a solution. And the other question I had, or maybe an interest that could be developed further, is the passage from the heart to the liver in the discussion from Nancy to Francisco. Mm-hmm. Would be interesting to investigate further. I think it would be very interesting.
Well, it's interesting also. I thought about that as I was reading them, and I felt I needed to include a lot of Nancy because so much of Francisco's text, really, the voices are grafted together. You hear Francisco's voice, but you really hear him listening and taking something from Nancy, even down to the way he formulates certain things. But when you read Nancy, it's actually quite interesting because he develops the symbolic and imaginary dimensions of the heart, whereas Francisco never went there. The symbolic dimension of the liver, I mean, I can remember, us talking about it and sometimes even making some, kind of jokes and humor about Prometheus and this sort of thing. But he certainly does not thematize it in this work, although he does thematize the question of the gift in imaginary terms and symbolic terms. So, yeah.
But maybe it has to do to the difference between what the heart embodies as the core of emotions, and emotions and imaginary symbolic dimensions are quite, can be really very interrelated, whereas the liver actually is really something more visceral. So it's maybe not so easy to make, to symbolize it, or to, I don't know. It's just a question. I'm wondering.
Yeah, but the liver, and I think Ev would have more to say on this. Doesn't it play like a way more important role in the Chinese medicine?
Of course, the moods and everything. Yeah,
the moods and everything. Yeah.
Of course. Yeah, it could be done as well. You're right. Yeah.
I was just going to actually put that in chat, but the liver is absolutely crucial in Chinese medicine for a whole range of emotions, often emotions like anger and resentment.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you're right, Evan, of course. Could be interesting to go further.
Yeah, for sure. Very interesting. Okay, I don't know, maybe any last very short questions or comments? No? Well, I was always really bad at this, really. I don't know, do you ever have that experience when you're reading a really long book? It's a really long book and you're like, come on, when will this end? And then you're kind of moving towards the end, the last 5 or 3 pages, and you already have this feeling of nostalgia. You don't really want it to end because you know that this story will it's somewhat similar now. So
I have it with series. With
series, it can be a similar experience, or many other things, because you get so involved with these, stories, life stories, and places and ideas, and then all of a sudden this world dissolves and goes away. So I haven't really prepared anything. I would just, first of all, like to thank Amy again for a really, really nice presentation. It was a really lovely, heartfelt presentation. Thank you very much for this. And I would also like to thank everyone who has helped with the organizational stuff, both on the Mind and Life Europe side and Metanoia's side. Basically, these were the people who have enabled this. So a big, huge thank you. And finally, I would also like to thank all of you guys, all the participants, everybody who was attending these meetings. Yeah, it's like one of those dynamic systems, right? Every new segment changes the whole. It's so true. I will definitely miss this. These were very meaningful events for me personally. I hope that they will bear fruit in the future as well. Everything is recorded, everything is available. I still remember when I started researching Francisco's work, you couldn't find almost anything online. Well, now we've altered this radically, I think. I will not basically thank you individually, but a special thanks goes to all of you who have, been around all the time and have participated at these sessions. So yeah, I would just repeat that I'm extremely grateful that I was able to share with you this experience. So if anybody else has anything to add to this, maybe.
Well, I do. I want to thank you, Sebastian, for your brilliant and bright and delightful moderation and indefatigability, if that's a word. And to say that thinking about Francisco's work, but also thinking about this particular crazy text, and it seems like what we've done together, I think Francisco would have used he liked the word enchantment, and I think we've taken some steps to enchanting his work by taking it each one in his or her own way and drawing it out in wonderful conversations. And so I think we've done him honor, and I think it's just a beginning.
I would definitely hope so. Yeah. So yeah, be well. Me and Amy, we have already talked about possible events next year, but you'll be informed of that. As Amy said, maybe this is just the beginning of something larger. Thank you again for participating, and yeah, be well.